I knew the moment I saw Brenda Pritchard from the HOA standing at my fence line with a garden trowel that my peaceful summer was about to end. She had that look on her face, the one that said she was about to make something my problem, even though I had done absolutely nothing wrong. I had moved into the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision in Naperville, Illinois about 8 months earlier, purchasing a nice 3-bedroom ranch house with a decent-sized backyard. The place was perfect for me, a 34-year-old software engineer named Thompson, who just wanted a quiet place to work from home and maybe grill some steaks on the weekend. The neighborhood seemed fine at first, neat lawns and friendly waves from most neighbors. Then I met Brenda. Brenda was the HOA president, a title she wore like a military rank. She was 52 years old with the kind of severely styled blonde hair that looked like it required industrial-strength hairspray and a standing appointment every week. She drove a white Lexus SUV and had opinions about everything from the exact shade of beige you could paint your shutters to whether wind chimes constituted a noise violation. I'd managed to avoid most interactions with her until that Saturday morning in early June when I looked out my kitchen window and saw her digging along the property line between my yard and the common area that bordered the back of my lot. I walked outside with my coffee mug, wearing basketball shorts and an old college t-shirt. The morning air was already getting humid, promising another hot Midwest summer day. "Morning, Brenda," I called out as I approached the fence. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Good morning, Harrison. I'm putting in a community vegetable garden here. The HOA board voted on it last month." I frowned, stepping closer to examine where she was working. The property line between my yard and the common area was marked by a simple chain-link fence that ran along the back of my lot. Brenda was digging on what looked like both sides of that fence. "That's great," I said slowly, "but it looks like you're digging on my side of the property line." "Oh, this is all common area," Brenda said dismissively, jabbing her trowel into the soil. "The fence is just decorative." I set my coffee mug down on my patio table and walked back inside to grab the survey documents from when I bought the house. I had learned early in home ownership to keep all that paperwork organized and accessible. When I returned, Brenda had already planted several tomato seedlings, and I could see the roots were definitely on my side of the fence by at least 2 feet. "Brenda, according to my property survey, the fence is actually on the property line. Everything on this side belongs to me." I held out the documents pointing to the clearly marked boundary. She barely glanced at them. "Those surveys are often wrong. Besides, it's just a few tomato plants. They'll look lovely, and the whole community can enjoy fresh tomatoes in a few months. You're not going to be difficult about this, are you?" The way she said difficult made it clear that anyone who disagreed with Brenda Pritchard was, by definition, being difficult. I had dealt with enough difficult people in my life to recognize the tactic. She was banking on me being too polite or too conflict-averse to push back. "I'm not trying to be difficult," I said, keeping my voice level. "But those plants are on my property. If you want to do a community garden, that's fine, but it needs to be entirely on the common area, not on my land." Brenda stood up, brushing dirt off her designer gardening gloves. "Harrison, I don't think you understand how HOAs work. We have certain rights to maintain community aesthetics and shared spaces. This benefits everyone." "I understand perfectly how HOAs work," I replied. "I also understand property rights. Those plants are on my property according to the legal survey. I'm asking you to move them to the other side of the fence." Her expression hardened. "I'll bring this up at the next board meeting. In the meantime, don't touch these plants. They're HOA property." She gathered her gardening supplies and walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with my now cold coffee and a row of tomato plants that were technically trespassing on my lawn. I spent the rest of that weekend researching Illinois property law and HOA regulations. The law was pretty clear. A property survey established the legal boundaries, and even HOAs couldn't override that without going through proper legal channels and getting the homeowner's consent. The tomato plants were on my property, which meant they were legally mine, regardless of who planted them. Monday afternoon, I received an email from the HOA's lawyer, a guy named Mitchell Pearson, who apparently handled all of Meadowbrook Estates' legal matters. The email was professionally worded, but essentially said that the HOA maintained the right to use property within 10 feet of any common area for community beautification projects, and that I was expected to cooperate. It also mentioned that failure to comply with HOA initiatives could result in fines. I replied with a polite but firm email explaining that I had reviewed the HOA bylaws and found no such provision, attached a copy of my property survey, and stated that while I supported community projects, they needed to remain on community property. I also mentioned that I would be happy to discuss a reasonable compromise if the HOA wanted to pursue an easement through proper legal channels. The response came from Brenda herself this time, not the lawyer. It was less professionally worded. She accused me of being hostile to community values, suggested that I clearly didn't understand suburban living, and informed me that the tomato plants would remain exactly where they were. She concluded by saying that if I interfered with the community garden in any way, there would be consequences. I sat at my home office desk, reading her email 3 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding the situation. Brenda had planted vegetables on my property without permission, refused to move them when I cited legal property boundaries, threatened me with fines through her lawyer, and was now personally threatening me with vague consequences if I touched plants that were growing on my own land. The situation would have been almost funny if it wasn't so frustrating. I decided to take the high road and simply ignore the tomato plants for the time being. Maybe Brenda would realize how absurd she was being, or maybe the rest of the HOA board would talk some sense into her. I had better things to do than fight over a few tomato plants. June turned into July, and the tomato plants grew beautifully. The weather was perfect for them, plenty of sun and regular afternoon thunderstorms that kept everything watered. Brenda had planted 8 tomato plants total, and they were the kind that produced those big, gorgeous beefsteak tomatoes. I could see them from my kitchen window, growing lusher and more productive every week. Brenda came by every few days to tend them, always making a point of waving at me if I was outside, like she had won some kind of victory. Other neighbors started commenting on the community garden, most of them unaware that it was actually planted on my private property. A few people even thanked me for donating the space, which made it clear that Brenda was telling people I had agreed to this arrangement. I corrected the record when I could, but I didn't make a big deal out of it. The situation bothered me, but I had work deadlines and other priorities. The tomato plants weren't actually hurting anything except my principal. Then in late July, the tomatoes started ripening. They were beautiful, deep red, and perfectly ripe. I was working from home on a Thursday when I saw Brenda in my yard harvesting tomatoes into a large basket. She had let herself into my yard through the back gate without asking permission or even knocking on my door first. That was the moment I decided I had been patient enough. I walked outside and called out to her. "Brenda, what are you doing?" She turned, holding a particularly large tomato. "Harvesting the community tomatoes. They're perfect this year. I'm going to distribute them at the HOA meeting tonight." "Those tomatoes are on my property," I said, walking across my lawn toward her. "You didn't ask permission to come into my yard." "Oh, don't be ridiculous, Harrison. These are community tomatoes. Everyone's been watching them grow all summer." "Everyone's been watching them grow on my property, where you planted them without permission," I countered. "I asked you to move them back in June. You refused. That means the tomatoes belong to me." Brenda laughed, actually laughed like I had made a joke. "You can't be serious. I planted them. I've been caring for them, and they're for the community. You had nothing to do with them. Except they're growing on my land, which makes them legally mine under Illinois property law. If I plant a tree on someone else's property, the tree belongs to the property owner, not to me." Her expression shifted from amused to angry. "If you touch these tomatoes, I'll have you fined by the HOA board. We can make your life very difficult, Harrison." I took a deep breath. I'd tried being reasonable, tried explaining the situation calmly, tried waiting for Brenda to see reason. None of it had worked. She had trespassed on my property, planted on my land without permission, refused to correct the situation, and was now threatening me while standing in my yard harvesting vegetables she had no legal right to. "Brenda, I want you to leave my property, now. Take your basket and go, but leave the tomatoes. They're mine." "These are HOA tomatoes," she insisted, clutching the basket. "They're on my property, which makes them my tomatoes. If you take them, that's theft. I'm not going to argue about this anymore. Please leave." We stood there in the hot July sun, staring at each other. Finally, Brenda made an exasperated sound, and stalked out of my yard, taking the basket of tomatoes with her. I watched her go, feeling my frustration reach a boiling point. That evening, I did something that probably wasn't the most mature response, but felt incredibly satisfying at the time. I went into my backyard with a large basket of my own and harvested every single ripe tomato from those 8 plants. There were dozens of them, beautiful and perfect. I filled an entire basket and then some, piling them on my kitchen counter. I also set up my phone to record video through my kitchen window, just in case Brenda decided to come back and cause a scene. I had a feeling this wasn't over. I was right. The next morning, Friday, I woke up to aggressive pounding on my front door. I looked at my phone and saw it was barely 7 in the morning. The pounding continued as I pulled on jeans and stumbled to the door. When I opened it, Brenda was standing there with her phone in her hand, her face red with anger. Behind her in the driveway, I could see a Naperville police cruiser. "You stole the community tomatoes," she shouted before I could say anything. "I called the police. You're going to jail for theft." I looked past her at the police officer, a young guy who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. He gave me an apologetic shrug. "Sir, I'm Officer Jake Martinez. We received a call about stolen property. Can you tell me what's going on here?" Before I could answer, Brenda launched into a tirade about how I had stolen dozens of tomatoes from the community garden, how I was a terrible neighbor who didn't care about community values, and how I needed to be arrested immediately for theft. Officer Martinez listened patiently, then turned to me. "Sir, do you want to explain your side?" I invited him inside, much to Brenda's protest. I showed him my property survey, the original emails from June, where I asked Brenda to move the plants, her refusal, the threatening emails from both her and the HOA lawyer, and finally, the view from my kitchen window showing exactly where the tomato plants were located. "So those plants are on your property?" Officer Martinez asked, looking at the survey. "Yes. She planted them on my land without permission. I asked her to move them. She refused and claimed they were on common area property, which is clearly false according to the survey." "And the tomatoes?" "I harvested vegetables that were growing on my property. That's not theft." Officer Martinez looked at the documents for another moment, then walked back outside where Brenda was waiting impatiently. I followed. "Madam, I've looked at the property survey. The plants appear to be on Mr. Thompson's property. That means the tomatoes belong to him. This is a civil property dispute, not a criminal theft case. You'll need to resolve this through the appropriate legal channels." Brenda's mouth fell open. "But I planted them. I took care of them. On his property without permission. I'm sorry, madam, but there's no crime here. If anything, you might be trespassing by entering his yard to tend plants on his land." "This is outrageous. The HOA will hear about this." "That's your right, madam, but I'm not going to arrest Mr. Thompson for harvesting vegetables from his own property. You folks have a good day." Officer Martinez walked back to his cruiser, leaving Brenda standing in my driveway, practically vibrating with rage. She pointed a finger at me. "This isn't over, Harrison Thompson. Not by a long shot." She stormed off to her house 3 doors down, and I went back inside, my adrenaline pumping. It wasn't even 8 in the morning, and I had already dealt with the police and a screaming HOA president. I made a strong pot of coffee and tried to settle down enough to get some work done. The weekend was quiet, which made me nervous. Brenda wasn't the type to let something go, especially after being embarrassed in front of a police officer. I kept expecting another confrontation, but nothing happened. The tomato plants continued growing in my yard, now relieved of their ripe fruit but already producing more. Monday morning, I found a formal letter from the HOA in my mailbox. It was 3 pages long and cited approximately 17 different HOA violations I had supposedly committed, ranging from obstruction of community beautification efforts to hostile behavior toward HOA leadership to removal of community property without authorization. The letter concluded with notice that I was being fined $500 and that failure to pay within 30 days would result in a lien being placed on my property. I sat in my car in the driveway, reading this absurd document, $500 in fines for harvesting vegetables from my own property. The violations were clearly invented, vague enough that Brenda probably thought she could make them stick through sheer determination and bureaucratic intimidation. I called a lawyer that afternoon. Her name was Patricia Chen, and she specialized in property law and HOA disputes. Her office was in downtown Naperville, and she agreed to see me the next day. Patricia was in her 40s, sharply dressed, and had the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. I explained the entire situation, showed her all my documentation, and handed her the letter of violations. She read through everything carefully, occasionally making notes on her legal pad. When she finished, she looked up at me with a slight smile. "This is one of the more clear-cut cases I've seen. The HOA president has no legal standing whatsoever. She planted on your property without permission, which is trespassing. The vegetables belong to you. And these violations?" She tapped the letter. "Most of them aren't even real violations according to your HOA bylaws. She's making this up as she goes." "So what do I do?" "I'll send a letter to the HOA board and their lawyer explaining the legal situation in very clear terms. I'll also demand they rescind these fines and issue a formal apology. If they don't comply, we can pursue legal action for harassment." "Will that work?" Patricia leaned back in her chair. "Usually, yes. Most HOA boards will back down when they realize they're on shaky legal ground and facing potential lawsuits. The problem is when you have an HOA president who's more interested in winning than in following the law. From what you've told me, Brenda Pritchard sounds like she might be that type." She was right. Patricia sent her letter on Wednesday. By Friday, I had another letter from the HOA lawyer, Mitchell Pearson. This one was more carefully worded but essentially doubled down on their position. They claimed that the common area extended 10 feet into private properties for maintenance purposes, that the community garden was a legitimate HOA initiative, and that my actions constituted interference with HOA operations. "They're bluffing," Patricia said when I forwarded her the email. "That's not how property law works in Illinois. They can't just claim your land for HOA purposes without an easement, and there's no easement in your deed or HOA documents." August arrived with oppressive heat and humidity. The tomato plants in my yard were producing like crazy, and I found myself harvesting more tomatoes every few days. I started giving them away to neighbors who weren't involved in the HOA drama, and I still had more than I could use. The irony wasn't lost on me that Brenda's spiteful little community garden was now providing me with enough tomatoes to feed half the neighborhood. The HOA scheduled a special meeting for mid-August to discuss what they called property violations and community standards. I knew it was really about me and the tomatoes. Patricia advised me to attend and let her come with me. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse on a Thursday evening. About 30 homeowners showed up, which was apparently a large turnout for Meadowbrook Estates. Brenda sat at the front table with 4 other board members, looking triumphant. She had clearly spent the past few weeks rallying support and painting me as some kind of neighborhood villain. The meeting started with standard HOA business, approval of minutes and financial reports. Then Brenda moved to what she called new business. "We need to discuss a serious situation involving one of our residents," she began, looking directly at me. "Harrison Thompson has been interfering with HOA community initiatives, specifically our community garden project. He has stolen property, violated multiple HOA bylaws, and shown complete disregard for our neighborhood standards." Several people in the audience murmured. I noticed some of them glancing at me with disapproving looks. Brenda had done her work well. Patricia stood up. "I'm Patricia Chen, Mr. Thompson's attorney. I'd like to address these allegations." Brenda's expression soured. "This is an HOA meeting for residents, not a legal proceeding." "Actually, Ms. Pritchard, if you're going to make formal accusations against my client that could result in fines or other penalties, he has a right to legal representation. Now, let's talk about what really happened here." Patricia proceeded to lay out the facts in clear, simple terms. She showed the property survey on the projector, demonstrated that the tomato plants were on my property, and explained that I had every legal right to harvest vegetables growing on my own land. She then addressed each of the supposed HOA violations in the letter I had received, systematically dismantling them by referencing the actual HOA bylaws. "Furthermore," Patricia continued, "Ms. Pritchard entered my client's property without permission on multiple occasions, which constitutes trespassing. She planted on his land without consent, and when he exercised his legal property rights, she filed a false police report claiming theft. These actions go far beyond an HOA dispute. They're potentially criminal. The room had gone very quiet. Several board members were looking at Brenda with confused or concerned expressions. It was clear that not everyone had heard the full story. One of the board members, an older man named Robert Chen, who I'd spoken with a few times at neighborhood events, raised his hand. "Brenda, is this true? Did you actually plant the garden on Harrison's property?" "The property line is unclear," Brenda said defensively. "The fence doesn't necessarily indicate the exact boundary." "I have the survey right here," Patricia said, holding up the document. "The property line is very clear. The fence is on the line. Everything on Mr. Thompson's side belongs to him." Another board member, a woman named Sandra Kim, spoke up. "Why didn't you move the plants when Harrison asked you to in June? If there was any question about the property line, that would have been the reasonable thing to do." "Because this is a community initiative," Brenda insisted, her voice rising. "We shouldn't have to accommodate one person who doesn't care about community values." "Community values don't override property law," Patricia said firmly. "And Mr. Thompson has been more than accommodating. He waited weeks hoping this would be resolved reasonably. When Ms. Pritchard not only refused to move the plants, but also threatened him, entered his property without permission to harvest vegetables, and then called the police making false accusations, he had every right to respond as he did." Robert Chen looked at the other board members. "I think we need to table this discussion and review all the facts. This isn't what I thought it was when Brenda brought it to the board." "We're not tabling anything," Brenda snapped. "We're voting on the fines and violations tonight. Brenda, if what Mr. Thompson's lawyer is saying is true, we could be opening the HOA up to a lawsuit," Sandra said. "I'm not comfortable voting on anything until we've had a chance to review the actual property documents and consult with Mitchell independently." "Mitchell already sent his opinion," Brenda argued, "but I could see she was losing control of the room." The board voted 4-1 to table the discussion, with only Brenda voting to proceed. The meeting continued with other business, but the energy had shifted. People were looking at Brenda differently now, and a few neighbors came up to me after the meeting to apologize for judging the situation without knowing the full facts. I thought that might be the end of it. The board had the information, they knew Brenda had overstepped, and surely they would tell her to drop the whole thing. But I underestimated Brenda's stubbornness and her unwillingness to admit she was wrong. 2 days after the HOA meeting, I woke up to find that someone had pulled out all 8 tomato plants during the night. They had been ripped from the ground and left in a pile on my lawn, roots and all, with most of the remaining green tomatoes smashed and scattered across my grass. I stood in my backyard in the early morning light, looking at the destruction. The plants had been thriving, producing beautifully, and now they were destroyed out of pure spite. I didn't need video evidence to know who had done this, though I wished I had set up a camera. I took extensive photos and called Patricia. She told me to file a police report for property destruction, which I did. Officer Martinez came out again, looking tired when he saw it was the same address as the tomato theft call from weeks earlier. "Let me guess," he said. "You're HOA president?" "I can't prove it, but yes, I'm pretty sure." He took photos and filed the report, but we both knew that without video evidence, nothing would come of it. The destroyed plants were only worth maybe $40 or $50, not enough for the police to invest serious resources in investigation. "Between you and me," Officer Martinez said as he was leaving, "you might want to set up some security cameras. This kind of HOA dispute can escalate. I've seen it before." I took his advice and installed 3 security cameras that afternoon, covering my backyard, side yard, and front entrance. They were good quality cameras that recorded to the cloud, with motion detection and night vision. If Brenda or anyone else tried anything else on my property, I would have evidence. The cameras paid off faster than I expected. 4 nights later, at 2 a.m, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the backyard camera. I pulled up the app and watched in real time as someone in dark clothing climbed over my back fence. The night vision showed them clearly, and even in the grainy footage, I could recognize Brenda's build and the way she moved. She was carrying something, and as she got closer to my back porch, the motion-activated light came on, illuminating her clearly. She had a bucket in her hand and was heading toward my sliding glass door. I watched as she tipped the bucket, dumping what looked like fertilizer or soil against my door and spreading it across my patio. I called 911 immediately, keeping my eyes on the camera feed. There's someone trespassing in my backyard. I have them on camera right now. The dispatcher asked for my address and details. I explained the situation quickly while watching Brenda finish whatever she was doing and head back toward the fence. She was climbing over when I heard sirens in the distance. I went downstairs and turned on my back porch light, looking out at my patio. The smell hit me immediately. Brenda hadn't dumped fertilizer or soil. She had dumped manure, real animal manure, all across my patio and against my sliding glass door. The stench was overpowering even from inside my house. 2 police cruisers arrived within minutes. I met them at my front door and showed them the camera footage on my phone. They could clearly see Brenda's face when the motion light came on, and the timestamp proved everything had happened in the last 10 minutes. That's Brenda Pritchard, I told them. She lives 3 houses down, number 847. She's the HOA president, and we've been having this dispute about property boundaries. One officer stayed with me while the other 2 went to Brenda's house. I could see lights coming on down the street and hear raised voices, though I couldn't make out the words. After about 15 minutes, the officers returned with Brenda in handcuffs. She was shouting as they walked her to the patrol car. "This is harassment. I'm the HOA president. You can't arrest me for trying to maintain community standards." "Madam, you were caught on video trespassing and vandalizing private property," one officer said calmly. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." They put her in the back of the cruiser and drove off. The officer who had stayed behind, a woman named Officer Lisa Park, took my statement and asked for copies of the video footage. "We'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow to file a formal complaint," she said. "But with video evidence this clear, the state's attorney will definitely pursue charges. This is criminal trespassing and criminal damage to property." I spent the next 2 hours cleaning manure off my patio in the middle of the night. It was disgusting work, and the smell lingered even after I had hosed everything down multiple times. But there was something satisfying about it, knowing that Brenda had finally crossed the line from annoying HOA busybody to actual criminal, and there was video evidence to prove it. The next morning, I drove to the Naperville Police Department and filed a formal complaint. I provided copies of all the camera footage, not just from that night, but also showing Brenda in my yard on previous occasions without permission. I also brought printed copies of all our email exchanges, the property survey, and the timeline of events dating back to June. The detective who took my statement, Detective Williams, listened to everything carefully. "This is pretty cut and dried," he said. "We have clear video evidence of her trespassing and vandalizing your property. The state's attorney will probably offer a plea deal, but if she insists on going to trial, you'll likely be called to testify." "Whatever needs to happen," I said. "I just want this to stop." News of Brenda's arrest spread through Meadowbrook Estates like wildfire. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from neighbors, some supportive, some confused, some clearly skeptical that the beloved HOA president could have done such a thing. The neighborhood Facebook group, which I had previously muted because it was 90% complaints about trash pickup schedules, exploded with hundreds of comments. Sandra Kim, one of the board members from the meeting, called me that afternoon. "Harrison, I want to apologize on behalf of the HOA board. We had no idea Brenda was doing any of this. The rest of us met this morning and voted to immediately remove her as president and suspend her from the board pending the outcome of the criminal case." "I appreciate that, Sandra. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted her to move the tomato plants off my property." "I know. We've reviewed everything, including the property survey and all the correspondence. You were completely in the right, and Brenda had no authority to do what she did. The HOA will formally rescind all those fines and violations she issued. We'll also send a letter to all residents explaining the situation so there's no confusion." "Thank you. That means a lot." The HOA followed through, sending out a detailed email to all Meadowbrook Estates residents explaining that there had been a dispute over property boundaries, that the HOA president had acted without board authority, and that all violations issued to my property were being rescinded. They didn't explicitly mention Brenda's arrest, but everyone knew anyway. Brenda was charged with criminal trespassing and criminal damage to property, both misdemeanors in Illinois. Her lawyer tried to argue that it was an HOA matter and not a criminal issue, but the video evidence was too clear. She had climbed over my fence in the middle of the night and deliberately vandalized my property. There was no HOA bylaw that could justify that. The case moved slowly through the system over the next few months. Brenda initially insisted on fighting the charges, apparently convinced that her status as HOA president gave her some kind of immunity. Her lawyer eventually convinced her otherwise. In October, she accepted a plea deal. 1 year of court supervision, 50 hours of community service, and restitution for the property damage, including the destroyed tomato plants and the cost of cleaning my patio. She also had to complete an anger management course. As part of the plea agreement, there was a stay-away order that prohibited her from coming onto my property for any reason. The restitution hearing was particularly satisfying. Patricia had documented everything: the cost of 8 mature tomato plants, the estimated value of the destroyed produce, my time cleaning the manure, professional cleaning services to fully remove the smell from my patio, and the cost of installing the security cameras that I now needed because of her harassment. The total came to just over $2,000. Brenda looked like she was going to explode when the judge ordered her to pay it, but she kept her mouth shut on her lawyer's advice. The judge also lectured her about respecting property rights and using proper legal channels to resolve disputes. "Ms. Pritchard, you're a homeowner yourself," the judge said. "You should understand the importance of property boundaries and the rule of law. Your position in the HOA gave you no authority to trespass, to plant on someone else's land without permission, or to vandalize their property when they objected. This kind of behavior is unacceptable in a civilized society. If I see you in my courtroom again for anything similar, you'll be facing jail time. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Brenda said quietly, all her earlier bluster gone. The HOA held new elections in November, and Sandra Kim was elected as the new president. She reached out to me personally to ask if there was anything the HOA could do to make amends. I suggested they create clearer guidelines about property boundaries and community projects to prevent this kind of thing from happening to anyone else. Sandra agreed and formed a committee to review and update the HOA bylaws. Brenda sold her house in January and moved to a different subdivision, apparently unable to handle the embarrassment of living in a neighborhood where everyone knew she had been arrested and convicted of harassing a neighbor. I felt a little bad about that, but mostly I just felt relieved that she was gone. The following spring, I planted my own garden in my backyard, well within my property boundaries. I included 8 tomato plants, the same variety Brenda had planted, and they grew beautifully. I gave away bags of fresh tomatoes to all my neighbors throughout the summer, including Sandra and several other people who had supported me during the whole mess. At the neighborhood 4th of July barbecue, Robert Chen came up to me with a beer and a smile. "You know, Harrison, that whole situation with Brenda was ridiculous, but I think it actually helped our community in the long run. We fixed a lot of problems with how the HOA was operating. We have better leadership now, and people are more aware of their rights as homeowners. So, thank you for standing your ground." "I just wanted to keep vegetables off my lawn that I didn't plant," I said, laughing. "But I'm glad something good came out of it." Standing in my backyard that evening, watching my neighbors enjoy food and conversation while kids ran around with sparklers, I felt genuinely happy with my decision to move to Meadowbrook Estates. The community was actually pretty great once you removed one toxic person from a position of power. The tomatoes that year were exceptional, possibly the best I had ever tasted. I made sauces and salsas, dried some for winter use, and still gave away more than I could count. Every time I picked a ripe tomato from one of those 8 plants, I thought about the absurdity of everything that had happened and felt grateful that I had decided to stand up for my property rights instead of just letting Brenda walk all over me. The camera system I had installed stayed up, and I still got occasional motion alerts, usually from neighborhood cats or the occasional raccoon. But there were no more middle-of-the-night vandalism incidents, no more threatening letters from the HOA, and no more drama over where vegetables could be planted. Patricia Chen and I stayed in touch, and she occasionally referred other clients to me who were dealing with HOA disputes. Apparently, my case had become somewhat well known in local property law circles as an example of how HOA overreach could backfire spectacularly. Patricia even used it as a case study when she gave presentations to other lawyers about HOA law. The Thompson tomato case, she called it, which always made me laugh. The criminal trespassing conviction on Brenda's record was public information, and I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had a hard time getting accepted into the HOA board of her new subdivision. Apparently, they did a background check and decided they didn't want someone with a conviction for HOA-related harassment in a position of authority. I felt a little bit of schadenfreude about that, though I tried not to dwell on it too much. The new HOA board under Sandra's leadership was night and day different from Brenda's regime. They actually followed the bylaws, they communicated clearly with residents, and they didn't try to invent new rules or fees without proper procedures. When they wanted to do another community garden project, they found an actual common area space that belonged to the HOA and got volunteers to help instead of forcing it on anyone. I even volunteered for a few hours, helping to build raised beds and install a drip irrigation system. Several people thanked me for my tech skills when I set up an automated watering timer, and nobody mentioned the previous year's drama. It felt like the community had collectively decided to move on and focus on actually being a community rather than a dictatorship run by one person. My own garden continued to thrive. I expanded it the second year, adding peppers, zucchini, and herbs along with the tomatoes. Several neighbors started their own gardens too, and we formed an informal gardening club where we traded seeds and produce and shared advice. It became one of my favorite parts of living in Meadowbrook Estates. The property line where the original 8 tomato plants had been was now just part of my regular lawn. I mowed over it every week, and there was no sign of the drama that had unfolded there. Sometimes when I was working in my garden, I would glance over at that spot and shake my head at how something so simple had spiraled into such chaos, all because one person refused to respect basic property rights and admit when she was wrong. I learned a lot from the experience about standing up for myself and not backing down when I was clearly in the right, even when facing intimidation and threats. I had been tempted so many times to just let it go, to avoid the conflict, to let Brenda have her way because it seemed easier than fighting. But I had stood my ground, documented everything, and followed the proper legal channels, and in the end, justice had been served. The story also taught me about the importance of good neighbors and community. Most of the people in Meadowbrook Estates had been supportive once they knew the full facts. They had been willing to question their HOA president's narrative and think critically about what was actually happening. That kind of community integrity was valuable and worth protecting. On quiet mornings when I sat on my back patio with my coffee, looking out at my garden and my properly maintained yard, I felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond just winning a dispute. I had defended my rights, exposed corruption and harassment, and helped make my community better in the process. The tomatoes were just tomatoes in the end, but what they represented about property rights, community values, and standing up to bullies was something much more significant. Sandra Kim stopped by one Saturday afternoon in late summer, bringing a basket of vegetables from the community garden. We sat on my patio, the same patio that had once been covered in manure, drinking iced tea and talking about garden yields and neighborhood gossip. "You know," she said, "I've been on the HOA board for 5 years, but I never really paid attention to what Brenda was doing until your situation forced us all to look closely. She had been getting away with little power trips and boundary violations for years, but nothing anyone wanted to make a big deal about. You standing up to her was a wake-up call for all of us." "I didn't mean to start a revolution," I said. "I just didn't want tomatoes growing on my lawn without permission." Sandra laughed. "Sometimes revolutions start over small things. The point is, you were right to stand your ground. Property rights matter, the rule of law matters, and holding people in authority accountable when they abuse that authority really matters." We talked for another hour about lighter topics, about our gardens and upcoming neighborhood events and the various small dramas that naturally occur when a couple hundred families live in close proximity. It was normal, pleasant conversation between neighbors who respected each other, and it reminded me why I had bought a house in a suburban subdivision in the first place. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, I walked through my garden one more time, checking for ripe vegetables and pulling a few weeds. The 8 tomato plants were heavy with fruit, and I picked several pounds of ripe tomatoes, filling another basket. I would take them to my Monday morning team meeting at work, I decided. My coworkers had been hearing stories about the infamous tomatoes for over a year now. They deserved to actually taste them. Looking back on everything that had happened, from that first morning when I saw Brenda planting on my property line through the criminal trial and her eventual conviction, I realized that the whole situation had been a masterclass in how not to handle community living. Brenda had taken what could have been a simple misunderstanding about a property line and turned it into a criminal case through her arrogance, her refusal to admit error, and her escalating attempts to intimidate someone into compliance. If she had just moved the plants when I first asked, or even if she had apologized and offered to relocate them after checking the survey, none of the rest would have happened. She could have remained HOA president, kept her house in the neighborhood she clearly loved, and avoided a criminal conviction. But her need to win, to never admit she was wrong, to punish anyone who dared question her authority, had destroyed all of that. There was a lesson in that about ego and power and the importance of humility, though I doubted Brenda had learned it. Some people never do. They go through life convinced they're always right, and that anyone who disagrees with them is an enemy to be defeated rather than a neighbor to be respected. But I had learned my lessons from the experience, and they were good ones. I had learned that documentation is crucial, that standing up for your rights is important even when it's uncomfortable, that most people will support you if they know the full truth, and that good legal advice is worth every penny. I had also learned that security cameras are a worthwhile investment, and that not everyone who holds a position of authority deserves that position. The tomatoes from my garden that second year were just as good as the first year's crop, maybe even better because I had chosen the varieties myself and planted them where I wanted them. I made my famous salsa recipe, the one I had perfected over 2 summers of abundant harvests, and gave jars of it as gifts at Christmas. People loved it, and several neighbors asked if I would teach them how to make it. On New Year's Eve, as I reflected on the past year and thought about the year to come, I felt grateful for how everything had worked out. The drama was behind me, the community was healthier, and my garden was flourishing. I had defended my property rights, stood up to harassment, and come out the other side with my principles intact and new friendships formed. The 8 original tomato plants were long gone, destroyed by Brenda in a fit of spite, but their legacy lived on in my garden and in the community gardens that dotted Meadowbrook Estates. Every tomato I harvested was a small victory, a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing is hard and uncomfortable and leads to conflict, but it's still worth doing. As I went to bed that New Year's Eve, I looked out my bedroom window at my backyard, lit by the soft glow of my patio lights. The garden beds were dormant now, resting through the winter, but they would burst back to life in spring. And when they did, I would plant tomatoes again, 8 plants just like before. But this time with no drama, no harassment, and no HOA president trying to claim vegetables that grew on my own land. It was a simple pleasure, growing tomatoes in my own backyard, but it meant more to me now than it had before. It represented autonomy and property rights and the freedom to enjoy my own home without interference. Those are American values, suburban values, the very things that HOAs are supposed to protect rather than undermine. Brenda Pritchard had learned that lesson the hard way, through arrest and conviction and public humiliation. I had learned it too, though through a very different path. And Meadowbrook Estates as a community had learned that accountability matters, that leadership requires integrity, and that property rights are not negotiable no matter how much someone wants to pursue their vision of community beautification. The next spring arrived with warm weather and longer days, and I was ready. I had new seeds, improved soil, and a whole season of growth ahead. On the morning I planted my tomatoes, several neighbors stopped by to watch and offer advice and share their own gardening plans. We talked about varieties and planting depths and watering schedules, normal conversations between people who shared a hobby in a community. Nobody mentioned Brenda or the drama from 2 years earlier. It was ancient history now, a story that had passed into neighborhood lore but no longer carried any emotional weight. That felt right. Life moves on, communities heal, and gardens grow. As I patted soil around the base of the 8th tomato plant, the same number that had started this whole saga, I smiled to myself. These plants were mine, on my property, planted with my own hands. They would grow and produce fruit that belonged to me, and I would share that fruit generously with my neighbors, because that's what community is really about: voluntary cooperation and mutual support, not forced compliance with someone's vision of how things should be. The tomatoes grew tall and strong that season, producing abundantly just like the years before. I harvested basket after basket of perfect red fruit, and my kitchen counter was constantly covered with tomatoes in various stages of ripeness. I made sauce and salsa, I ate them fresh in salads, I gave them away by the bagful to anyone who wanted them. And every single tomato was a reminder that I had stood my ground, protected my rights, and come out the other side with my integrity intact. That was worth more than all the tomatoes in the world, though I have to admit, those particular tomatoes tasted especially sweet. The security cameras stayed up, silent guardians that hopefully would never be needed again. The property survey stayed filed safely in my home office, proof of boundaries that would never again be questioned. And the garden continued to grow year after year, a testament to the simple truth that sometimes the best revenge is living well and growing excellent tomatoes on your own property, exactly where they belong. Years from now, when I'm old and hopefully still gardening, I'll probably tell this story to anyone who will listen. It will be my back in my day story, the tale of the HOA president who thought she could ignore property lines and intimidate a homeowner into compliance, only to end up with a criminal conviction and a ruined reputation. It will be a cautionary tale about the abuse of power and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's easier to just go along. But more than that, it will be a story about tomatoes. 8 tomato plants that grew on the wrong side of a fence and sparked a battle over property rights that ended with justice served and a community improved. Because that's what good stories are really about, not the conflict itself, but what we learn from it and how we grow. Just like tomatoes, we all need the right conditions to thrive. Good soil, adequate water, plenty of sunshine, and most importantly, respect for boundaries and space to grow. Brenda Pritchard forgot that lesson, or maybe never learned it in the first place. But I learned it, and I learned it well, and my garden is better for it. So here's to property rights, to standing your ground, to documentation and security cameras and good lawyers. Here's to neighbors who support each other and communities that value truth over authority. And here's to tomatoes, wherever they grow, as long as they're growing in the right place with the permission of the person who owns the land. My 8 tomato plants taught me all of that and more. They were the best gardening teachers I ever had, even though technically I didn't plant them. But I harvested them, every last one, and that made all the difference.